So we had mentioned the fact that we're going to be using single page applications, right, where we load a single page and then we never navigate away from this page, right? Instead, we provide navigational functionality by instead replacing the current DOM with other DOM elements, right? Giving you the feeling that you've actually navigated, right? That you're showing different content depending on having clicked here or there. So to do that, we're going to need to import a couple of other libraries that support navigation. Navigation doesn't come in the default implementation of the React library. We need to load another library that allows us to do navigation. There are a couple of solutions for navigation, but this is the one that is most popular. So we already had a hello world, and here we had a simple application that contained that hello world. So we have that. And to support navigation, we're going to install a new library called a browser router, which is part of this package, the package React Router DOM. And so we'll need to install that. So it's a npm install React Router DOM. Save. So it's going to download the library, install it in my local node_modules, and then we're going to need to import it from our application. Okay. All right. So let's do that. Let's create a little application where we have a router. So the way this works is that the router mechanism, what it does is that it allows you to declare several links, hyperlinks, like you would declare any hyperlink whatsoever. But then it allows you to declare several routers that say if you see a change in the URL, right? Then map that particular URL to this particular DOM element, or map this particular URL to this other DOM element, or this DOM component, right? The underlying routing mechanism makes use of a really old functionality that's been there all along in HTML since the beginning, right? Which uses hashes, right? If you use an anchor in HTML, you can create a hyperlink that well, we all know that you can create a hyperlink that navigates to another page, of course, yes. But you can also create a hyperlink that navigates to the same page, stays in the same page. You just scrolls down or scrolls up, right? You can declare anchors all the way through your documents, right? Giving them names, unique names, and then you can refer to them in an anchor in the same page using the hashtag, and then the name of a particular anchor that you have in your particular document. Yes. So this behavior has been in there all along since the beginning of time, and of web time, and so these routes, Angular and React all use this mechanism as by creating listeners, JavaScript listeners, event listeners that look at they hijack this mechanism. They hijack this mechanism and they build an entire framework around it, right? And it says, okay, well, I'm going to hijack that mechanism that allows you to navigate up and down in HTML, and I'm going to listen an event handler that listens to the changes in that URL, everything that is after the hash. Yes, if it changes, what I'm going to do, I'm going to create a mechanism that allows you to map those URLs after the hash. So you can say, well, I want this component to render if the hash is this, or I want this component to render if the hash is that, right? And then it creates all these elements, router and link and routing and whatsoever, to allow you to configure all this. Make sense? All right. So let's play around with this. I'm losing my. Am I yelling? Oh man. We're going to be using the browser router. So let's load this in our index here, where we have a whiteboard. And let's see. Let's import that. Okay, it didn't complain. So this is doing an extract from whatever that default package inside of that component in here, and it's extracting the browser router. Browser router because we're going to be browsing in a browser, but there's certainly other devices that we can also do routing, right? Like in a device, in a handheld device, it wouldn't be a browser router. And we are just renaming it to router just because the library changed recently, and it was called just router, right? And so a lot of the code that was not backwards compatible, they wanted to be able to make a very easy way for you to use your code that you already have, so that you can use the new versions of this library. Anyway, so now that we have that, we can then declare here in our whiteboard, we can declare a router. And router can declare many routes, and say, and the routes will do a mapping and say, well, if you see this in the URL, this is the component that you want to render, and if you see that, then this is what I want you to render. Make sense? Okay, so here's a couple of routers that we can use and say, and we can declare several links that say these components, these link components that are declared by the new library, they actually render into just normal hyperlinks. So we could all implement this just with a plain old hyperlink, right? But let's stick to this. So let's see. We can say we will need link and route. So let's load that too here. And so we can say we can create a link here. It doesn't have to be inside of the router. It could be out here. And this says a router and says, what do you want to render if the path is XYZ? Yes? Right? So for instance, we might create a route here and say that if you see let's see, if you see the modules, then I want you to render the module list, right? And that if you see instead tabs or lessons, then I want you to render lessons. Then if you see lessons, then I want you to render the lesson tabs. Let's see if we broke this. Oops. Import container fluid React. What are we missing here? Filter router is marked as required, but it's we don't have router. Router. Link. Oops, I killed it. Oops, wait a minute. Let me restart that. PM start. Let's see. Want to render. This is when I stray from my cheat sheet. Webpack that doesn't like it. Container fluid. Blah, blah, blah. Let's see. What don't you like here? Oh yes, probably this wants to be inside of a div. There we go. All right, so let's see. If we click on module list, Notice that if I click on lessons, the lessons tab appears. But we already actually have the module list, so that's not fair. We already had the module list in there, so let's see. We can grab something else. Oh, actually, the modules. We can have maybe the topics, and we have topics here, and then we can list here and say if you see topics. Then load the topics pills. So there they are. So if I click on topics, there are the topics, here are the lessons, and here are the modules. So basically what it's doing is saying, look at the changes in the URL, right? And depending on what you see in the URL, load the following components. Now here we're doing a small component, but that component could be an entire page. Right? We have content down below, which is part of just one big example, right? So here we're loading whatever component. Where a component might be an entire component. So we can for instance, do we have course editor? Yeah. So for instance, this here, right? This whole thing here could be a course grid, right? This could be the course grid. So we could perhaps implement that here. We can say component course grid. So file course grid .js and do an import on React from React and declare here the course grid. That returns this whole thing. And course card, we'll need to import that too. Import card from course cards. Oh, course cards. Oh wait, cards. And make sure that that actually works. In whiteboard, we can load it down below, see if it indeed that worked. So course grid, sorry, course. Oh, we didn't export it. We need to export it here. We'll say export default course grid. And here we can say course. We're not exporting it. Stateless. Default stateless. Course grid. Default course grid. Yeah. Course cards. And whiteboard would be, let's see, would be course grid. And we can import course grid from course grid. There's a course grid twice, yes? So what this would allow us to do is to do a route link that would allow you to look at the grid, course grid, have a nice little icon, right, and allow you to load the grid, course grid, or it'll show you the toggle, right, and show either the course grid or the course table, back and forth, right? Or when you click on a particular more here, right, you can have a link so that now it replaces the whole thing with a course editor, right? And the course editor contains, the module list and everything else. Make sense? Right. All right. So let's keep going a little further. So here's just the example that is shown here is that it creates two trivial pages, right? Page 1 and page 2. two components, two stateless components, page 1 and page 2. And then it links them together and says whether I want to show you page 1 or page 2. And if you click on page 1, you show 1 or 2. But the interesting part is being able to parameterize these things, right? For instance, if you want to select a particular course, you want to pass along to say, oh, you selected this course, this particular course, right? So presumably with the ID of that course, you can pass it as an argument, so that the modules, the course editor, can then load the course that you clicked on, right? If you clicked on another course, it would load some other course. Make sense? So you need to be able to parameterize these things. So one way to parameterize it is to the route, the path, have a colon ID, right? A placeholder that can take as argument, so that now the component can then read that element, that was passed in. So here the example is that you have two links with two values, 1, 2, 3, and 2, 3, 4, and you can click on one or the other, and then page param can then read the value of that ID and then load one thing or load another thing. Make sense? All right. So page param, in this case, it's so the way it's passed along to the component is passed along as a map, right? And that map is called match, right? That match, and in there you have all the parameters. So match.params.id. ID is the name of the placeholder. In this case, is ID. Right here, this ID, colon ID. So whatever you call that, that would be the name in there. So here's another example, page update, and then it renders the state of that ID. So also when you have these, when you use these IDs, there's a quirk in React that it tries to optimize the fact that it has already loaded a component, right? It's already rendered it, and if you ask it to render it again, it'll just use the last version of that component, right? Trying to optimize how many, the re-rendering of the DOM, right? So when you navigate to a parameterized component and you pass a value as an argument, as a parameter, it'll use it the very first time. It'll do any dynamic rendering that it needs to do. But once it has calculated that DOM and you navigate again to the same component, regardless of whether the parameter is different, it'll say, oh, I've already instantiated this component. I'm not going to rerun and re-render the whole thing. I'll just use the latest. So it's lazy loading and ignoring the fact that you have a completely different new parameter, right? Whereas you wanted to take some actions and say, well, no, it's a different parameter. I want to do something different, right? I want to go fetch new data from the server. So to do that, you need to add some state management to bind these changes. In this case, we need to use what it's called some state, component lifecycle methods, right? Like the constructor is called when the component is first instantiated, yes? But there's a whole bunch of other lifecycle methods that are called at different times. For instance, when a property is passed as an argument, as an attribute, right? There's a lifecycle component, method that gets called, saying, "Oh, you got new properties, right? The properties changed, right? The arguments changed." So these lifecycle methods, such as component did mount and component will receive properties, will be invoked whenever properties are passed along as arguments, right? So this is a mechanism that allows you to react to the fact that these properties have changed, indeed changed. Okay. Another thing that allows you to, for a little more advanced, is that in the render, you can, instead of providing the name of the component, right? Usually the simplest thing is to provide the name of the component, right? Instead, I'm sorry, the route you can provide as the attribute component, the component you want to render, yes? But if you have something much more complex to render, instead of using the component, you can use the attribute render, right? And render takes as argument a function that can calculate on the fly, what is it that you want to render in particular, right? In here, it's a simple function that it's just rendering a hello elements, right? But this function can take arguments, any arguments that you pass along in the link, and then you can use it in the component, the internal component. So here, for instance, is hello that can take as argument a name argument that you can take as parameter here in the name that you pass along. So that's another mechanism of creating these to be dynamic.